Okay.
All
So
right.
welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Those of you who are participating, we're going to ask that you would remain or ask your questions in the chat. Once we go live, I will introduce our panelists for today and give a brief overview of FDI and move on from there. But we encourage you to please post your questions in the chat and we will respond to them at that time. So thank you again for joining us. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm not sure if we're having a delay. Welcome everyone to the Frederick Douglass Institute at Edinboro University. And our topic for this evening on social justice pedagogy, we're excited to have with us several panelists who will help us dialogue about social justice initiatives, particularly not just in higher ed, but how do we respond to some of the things and events that has happened and prepare our communities, our future educators and professionals on how to respond to this, particularly in the classroom. With us tonight is the co-director at Edinboro University and the Frederick Douglass Initiative is Dr. Kevon Bruce. Dr. Bruce is assistant professor in the counseling program at Edinboro University. So we're excited about his presence. He's also a former FDI scholar, and so we're excited to have him with us. We're also joined today by Dr. Margaret Smith. Dr. Smith is a professor in the social work department and a former co-chair, co-director of the Frederick Douglass Institute at Edinboro and on the PASHI Collaborative, and such a wonderful supporter around Frederick Douglass as well as social justice initiatives. Thank you, Dr. Smith, for being with us today. And finally, but certainly not least, is Dr. Susan Curtin, who is currently a professor at the University of South Dakota. She is a former faculty member at the University of Edinboro and director of the Frederick Douglass Institute. Dr. Curtin has also served as an assistant dean for the School of Education. So we're excited, or the graduate's office, we're excited to have her with us tonight. And she and I will talk a little bit about some formal research that we were able to conduct together. So thank you all for, again, joining us. Our participants who are with us this evening, we've asked that they would present questions in the chat if they have questions for any of our panelists or have comments on any of the dialogue that we engage in tonight. I just want to share very briefly, the Frederick Douglass Initiative is a collaborative across the PASHI system that many of the PASHI schools have present on their campuses. And as many of you know, Frederick Douglass was one of our iconic symbolisms around social justice and the work that he did to bring about social justice initiatives, particularly around African Americans. And so we use many of his principles and his experiences as a platform that help us to continue to push these, to push social justice agendas and bring awareness to social justice initiatives and efforts in our communities and especially across the PASHI campuses. So thank you again for joining us. I just want to throw a question out to the group, and Dr. Bruce and I will spend some time even maybe tag teaming a little bit and asking our panelists, but he's certainly going to contribute today as a panelist himself. But to everyone on the panel, when you talk about social justice pedagogy, why are we still talking about that in 2021? You would think that, you know, the old Virginia Slim slogan, we've come a long way, baby. Like, have we not come a long way that we are still not talking about why and how this needs to be incorporated into our lessons and into our instructional curriculum. So I'll open it up to any of the panelists, and certainly panelists, you are willing to share any more that you would like to with our audience tonight. Thank you.
Well, there's a saying by Nelson Mandela that education is the most powerful weapon which can be used to change the world. And so if you think about the fact that in our society, education is not equitable. So those young people who receive an education that is somewhat inferior and under-resourced still have the greatest struggle. The ACEs studies, which is adverse childhood, those young people who go to inferior schools tend to have disproportionate income, health, and they tend to live in communities that are high in asthma. And so we're still talking about it because we've never really resolved the issue that there are the haves and the have-not by birthright, not by being a citizen.
And so when you talk about that, Dr. Smith, would you say more about that in terms of the birthright versus being a citizen or feeling as if you are accepted as an equal citizen? Can you share a little bit more about that?
Well, you look at the historical designation of people of color, and they were never considered full citizens. And so there have been laws that have instituted full citizenship. But if you look today, the Voting Rights Act is being dismantled. So we've never had permanency. So in Pennsylvania, education is funded by real estate taxes. And so if you live in a community in which is low income, it is less resourced. And for years, we've been talking about there should be parity. It shouldn't have to do with where a young person lives, whether the school is funded or not. And so I'll give you an example. My daughter was going to Westinghouse High School, and I was part of a parent group, and so we went to Alderdice. Alderdice is located in Squirrel Hill, which is a predominantly Jewish area, and where we live was a mixed area down in Homewood. And when we went in, my daughter asked me, "Mom, why do they have erasers and we don't?" Something as simple as erasers for a board, the low income school didn't have. And one of the young people looked at the textbook. She said, "This is for 12th graders, but we don't have that." Their book was 2 years less than the current book that school children were using in Alderdice. So those are just basic examples. You would never know unless you go out into other communities and see the resources they have. So in Pennsylvania, we're always going to have a disparity in education because it's built into the system. And until we say that every school and every child should get $10,000 to go to school, it'll be that way because there are communities that are under-resourced.
Thank you. I mean, I do think that we know that there are certainly resource issues, whether we're talking about underrepresented minorities or low income families and communities. So, you know, that certainly from a social justice perspective goes well beyond just even racial boundaries, but we know in terms of the poverty line that we see some of those challenges happening. Dr. Curtin, I'm just gonna ask, you know, from moving from this part of Northwestern New York to going to South Dakota, you know, what are some of the challenges you see there geographically, or how has this manifested differently from a geographical lens?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, you know, just a quick answer to your question, we're still talking about this because the work is not done. And I would say in South Dakota, the work is not done. In some ways, just beginning. You know, I think we have a larger Native population. So Native Americans are called Native here. And so it's manifesting itself that way here. I just had a dissertation this morning, and we were talking about the historical trauma that Native learners face because of the way that they were treated and sent off to boarding schools, and their culture was stripped away. And that is still very much a part of the culture here, and the way that they feel. And I also think in, going back to Dr. Smith, there's underrepresentation in the K-12 educational system also. And so when you don't see that, and when people aren't talking about that, then it doesn't build itself into the culture. And so instead of having an inclusive culture from kindergarten on up, you just don't. And so the work is starting almost backward. We really need to get to front load that work. But I've noticed very, 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 very big differences culturally here, and a very strong political influence, to be honest. There's a strong little bit of a resistance to even the term social justice, and what that word means. And so when we don't have a clear understanding of the operational language that we're using, that's also a barrier to the work that needs to be done. So those conversations are really seem basic, but it is where we need to begin, is to have conversations and discuss what that means.
Thank you. I mean, I think you raise a really valid point around having those conversations and having shared meaning. And I definitely want to, there's a question in the chat and we'll come back, but I want to get Dr. Bruce's perspective on, having been and working in schools as a school counselor. How does this translate to that K-12 population? And what are some of the things that we see occurring, and where are some of the gaps that we have in schools? And, I'm just reminded of my oldest daughter. Now we're talking well over, 25 years ago, but I remember when she was in preschool, she came home and she kept talking about how she needed to clean her face. Her face was dirty. And I couldn't, and I kept saying, there's nothing on your face. Well, the second day that she kept insisting that something was on her face, I asked her the question, Ariel, why do you feel like your face is dirty? Because she was a peculiar little kid. She didn't like dirt and she didn't like anything sticky. So I thought maybe she was having a sensory issue. And she says the name of a youngster that's in her daycare, her preschool classroom, told her that her face was dirty. And it hit me at that moment that she was not really talking about something that was on her, but she was talking about who she was. Now, mind you, my that particular daughter was incredibly fair-skinned when she graduated in a pretty much predominantly white graduation class from high school. It took me a minute to locate her because she blended in. That's how fair she is. So you understand contextually that this young person who made this comment wasn't necessarily wasn't racially driven, but just had lack of understanding or exposure. So having that shared meaning in the conversations and opportunity to pursue these opportunities within our educational platforms is so critical. Dr. Bruce, can you comment on that in terms of your experience as a school counselor? What's been some of the dynamics in schools, particularly with K-12?
Yeah, I think Dr. Smith, she was reaching on that when it comes to the resources. As a school counselor, I was able to see not all of it, but some of the budget that came from the board. And we also had very candid conversations with some of the educators. Most of the schools I worked in were predominantly white educators, and we did service students of color. So we would have these candid conversations. And back when I was a school counselor, we had the training, what is it called? Courageous Conversations. So even during those trainings, a lot of the educators would admit to not really understanding or being able to work with students of color, and they didn't need to until they received that master's degree and then they worked into the population. They grew up in homogeneous societies where they didn't have Black students in their classrooms, and then for me, coming from Brooklyn, New York, and like Dr. Smith was saying, I come from Brooklyn where it was 99% Black students and we had 99% Black educators. So to then turn and become an educator myself and work in a school that I thought was servicing students of color, and that, you know, we would have equal opportunities because of the resources that was allocated to these counties, that wasn't the truth. So we also, we would funnel most of the money into, let's say, I was in Talbot County, so we had Easton High School, and then we also had St. Michael's High School. A lot of the funding will go to St. Michael's High School, even though St. Michael's and Easton were in the same county. And of course, as you guys can guess, St. Michael's had 75% Caucasian students, and then Easton would have 60% African American, but they're in the same county. So, you know, it's just these rules that would go back dated before I was even in school, before I was even born. But there are things in place in this country that would honestly hold us back from having that equal opportunity. Even though education is supposed to be the equalizer, it is not. So it's just interesting to see the systems that are in place that I don't think that can be eradicated within my lifetime, but that doesn't mean the work should stop. And I think, you know, I don't know how much you guys know, but I teach the multicultural counseling courses here at Edinboro. And every semester I bring into the classroom Jane Elliott. I definitely use a lot of her work because she is an anti-white, anti-racism educator. She's a white woman herself. And I believe that in order for us to have a voice, have a platform, we need to have people who don't look like us. We need to have someone from the majority to help this fight. And I think she's very important. So if you're not familiar with Jane Elliott, definitely look at what she's doing. And I think when it comes to social justice, she is definitely one of the pioneers for white women who are helping people of color push forward.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce. That's really interesting because, you know, one of the things that we probably will not have time to talk about is, again, greater than some of the systems and the structures we're going to be talking about, but just even the way systems are constructed or cities are constructed. So geographically, whether we're in South Dakota or whether we're here, you know, in Northwest Pennsylvania, Northeast Pennsylvania, that there are some design to cities and communities that also reinforce these challenges that we're seeing and the gaps that we're seeing. And that's just not unique to particular, you know, groups, but certainly there are some unique pieces depending on which population we're talking about or the underrepresented population. And that really is a whole conversation and presentation in and of itself. I do want to read the comment in the chat from Lacelia Williams. And the comment is, will Edinboro University continue with the FDI Scholar Fellowship for the upcoming 2021-22 academic year? And if so, when does the application period open? Unfortunately, we will not at Edinboro be participating in the fellowship program this coming year. Many folks have heard that EU, along with 2 other schools in the Apache system, are looking at merging. And so trying to make sure that, you know, when you're bringing someone in and onboarding, there's all kinds of dynamics about them coming into the system. I also think is so critical because that FDI scholar role, which Dr. Bruce, who was a scholar and is now on a tenure track professor, that's the intention there, is to bring folks in to influence from a cultural and diverse perspective. And so, you know, again, that gets a little interesting as we're looking to merge. How do you bring someone in and look at redefining all that, and as at a time when we're really trying to really figure out where people are going to land. So, I mean, I certainly agree with the provost that this was not probably the year, as people are in so much transition, that position, and I'm sure Dr. Bruce could speak to that, you know, the mentoring and the support of that position, you want to make sure that they are securely embedded in your system and culture so that they can have meaningful impact. My hope would be is however we reconfigure in the new EU, that the FDI will be a strong and a consistent part of that structure, and that we can get back to really trying to make sure that we're bringing people in with great backgrounds and diversity, and that can really meaningfully contribute to our culture, like FDI scholars like Dr. Bruce. And honestly, we've had people that came out of our programs at Edinboro that went on to be scholars in other places throughout the PASHE system. So it is a great program, and I'm confident that we'll get back to it. But right now, I think we're trying to figure out who we are and where that person would even land and have the appropriate supports to be able to shine. So thank you.
Also, I'll add to that. So Edinboro, we are not looking for a fellow, but there are 5 other schools within the PASHE school system that are going to be having a fellow for the next academic year. And I believe that, you know, your experience there would be as enriching because the program, we have very strict guidelines. So every experience at each campus will definitely be enriching. So Bloomsburg, Kutztown, Shippensburg, Slippery Rock, and Westchester are having a fellow for next year, if that is applicable for you to apply to those universities.
Thank you, Dr. Bruce. And I believe that the deadline is usually towards the end of February. Am I correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. No worries. So let's go back to a comment I think that came up about how do we really integrate this? If we all know that the work still really truly is beginning, or sometimes we take, you know, some steps forward and we still have lots and lots of work to do depending on what systems or administrations are in place, and I mean the broader administration that is. What is it that we need to do to ensure that we are bringing social justice? Not, you know, people talk about, oh, we're talking about diversity and multiculturalism, but really when we talk about social justice, this is a particular element that needs to be embedded in this diversity discussion, that it's not just, you can't look at a blanketed diversity perspective and just say, or believe that social justice dynamics will be covered. So how do we go about ensuring that is covered, and what is it that we want to accomplish in making sure that social justice, that we're teaching people about how to embed this in their curriculum, or how this should play out in their education with others, or even, you know, as a clinician, a counselor and a psychologist, how is this playing out, or how do I want to educate you know, prospective counselors and psychologists about looking at this and integrating social justice in their practice? Anybody?
Well, you know, I think it's broadly, it comes out in the frameworks that you use, and the curriculum, and the textbooks that you choose. Are you honoring all voices? Who are the authors that you're using? What are the theoretical frameworks that you're presenting? What kind of strategies are you, instructional strategies are you using? Are they the kind of strategies that work best for all populations? You know, quite frankly, straight lecture doesn't work for everyone. And so are we mixing those so to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to learn? And I think building relationships, you know, how are we honoring our students, and how are we showing them how to honor one another? Because sometimes we have to call them out and just say, we need to honor all voices. And when we're talking about that, this is what that looks like. So we have to model that too. And we have to respect the cultures. I'll give you a very quick specific example, and then I'll cede to Dr. Smith. But in Native culture where I am, so we're Lakota and Dakota, often they don't wish to present an image of themselves, and I teach online. And so I don't require that. And for the introductory discussion, I have them choose a symbol instead of a photo or a narrative description that would send a message to us about who they are. And that is a way of honoring the culture of the Native learner and bringing that into the classroom. So not only honoring it for that person, but also making sure that students don't have to ask for it. You know, that we are educated enough and we are aware enough that we make sure our students don't have to ask for accommodations, much like universal design, you know. So Dr. Smith, did you want to comment?
Well, one of the things that I think for most people is when you say social justice, they think they're going to lose something. And so for me to gain, I have to lose. Well, if we think about my getting something does not take away from you, but it may be equalizing what you have. And so I think about this benefits and burdens, and how we distribute it. And most people will say, if women get something, men are going to get less. Or if straight people get something, gay, lesbians are going to get less. But if we looked and say, can we all have the same? Can I have equal right to education and live in a good community? And can you do the same without feeling that I've taken something away? So I think that the hardest conversation we have is to help people understand that because someone else gets something doesn't take away from you. And that if you look at the history will reveal that there have been some shortcomings for that group. And so we often have that really hard discussion about others. Other people are getting something and I'm not, which happened with the stimulus. I didn't get one. I was a little upset about that.
I'm with you, Dr. Smith. I didn't get one.
Those are some things that I think we should help our students also to think about. Is because we work for another group doesn't mean that you're going to have less. And I think that's the hardest conversation for people to understand.
Well, yeah, can I comment on that? However, redistributing power does mean some people will have less power, and that is the big threat. And I do think people feel threatened by that. Would you agree?
Well, I think that it's all in how we present it.
Yeah, and in how we prepare people to handle that and to say, okay, that's okay. That's a big shift. I think that's a big shift.
There was it was on today, a History Channel, and the community was all white and an African-American moved in. And the press made such a big deal about him moving in that community. And so when they asked him, why did you move here? He said, I'm a World War II veteran and I should be able to go wherever I choose to go and not have to worry about this kind of publicity. But the press made it more than it was. And of course, then you bring out all the other people. And so sometimes it is the way that the press responds to things that really causes other people to look at it negatively, rather than if there was no publicity and all of the hoopla that goes with that. So I think that these kind of things, to me, contribute to the negative stereotype of people like, why did you move here? Well, the press come and say, why did you move here? You know, and the community might not have said anything without all of that attention being drawn. And right now, that seems to be the focus. Is sometimes it's the way that the press responds to incidents that give heightenedness about it.
So I think this is a really good point, and you're right. I mean, there is the fear of losing something, and I think part of it, my experience has been, it's like this fear of detrimental loss. Like it means that there's going to be this huge impact on me in some way, rather than the appreciation. And in some cases, I think you're right, Dr. Curtin, there's going to be loss. And in some situations, it may be that power differential is going to be significant. And so there is resistance about giving that up and having to engage differently. And a lot of times it is those relational pieces about moving differently, about how you interface with folks around you or within the community, which means you have to re-examine who you are in that context, and how you are positioned with other people. And I think that becomes the greater fear, that I'm now re-evaluating and reassessing myself, which earlier on, prior to going live, we all had a behind the scenes sidebar conversation about the book, about how to be anti-racist. And I think the author was really getting at that. that some people are not ready for that kind of change, and that what we're tugging at is very core values, beliefs, and behaviors that really put people, I think, more at risk than than we see it as just behavior or concrete action, that is really much deeper to that, and that really scares them.
Yeah, and I think that's, and maybe you can speak to that, the study that we did, but you know, we have to give them a safe place to practice those kind of conversations and to ask questions that they think are dumb or they're afraid to ask the question. So I think as an educator, I feel very responsible for creating a safe space to have a conversation and to just honor where people are.
Right. And I'm not sure if you were part of a training, but both Dr. Smith and I were trained in the NCBI training, which really speaks to that this is, you know, most people feel like you're going to pull at my core of who I am and shift me or change me, versus it's about having shared understanding.
Right.
It's not about necessarily change, and you're right, having a safe place at which to do that. And having taught, you know, the multicultural class for many, many years, doing diversity training and consulting myself, that safe place is so important. And Dr. Curtin and I years ago did a research study where we looked at our classes. At the time, Dr. Curtin was predominantly teaching online. I still had face-to-face classes. We were both teaching multicultural and diversity courses. And so we wanted to see whether or not there was a difference in between, you know, students who were face-to-face in person versus what happens when you're in a remote, online, anonymous format. And boy, did we find out some really interesting things, I think a little different than what we would have expected, but it was really fascinating. Dr. Curtin, you want to talk about your impression of that research project, what, you know, the results and what you thought about that?
Yeah, I had some surprises there. And we talked a lot about what we might expect and what do we do with it once we have it. So, you know, the courage in teaching social justice is you have to be prepared for a lack of social justice perspective. And what do we do with that and how do we get there? And so I was surprised at how the perception of anonymity gave people more courage to say things that were unkind that they would not have felt comfortable saying in person. I knew that intellectually, but I was surprised and disappointed by that. Yeah. And I was pleasantly surprised, though, by those who had the courage to counteract that.
And I think that sometimes we don't think about the traumatic experiences that students have in schools. You know, we think that because you're on a college campus that everybody is going to treat you kind or whatever, but people forget that they bring their history with them, you know, and so for some students, their experience in schools have not been good, and they bring that history to college, and then they may be the only person in the class, and they're expected to represent everybody that everyone ever thought about in that group. And that's really hard for a teacher who has not resolved in themselves that that person doesn't represent the group. They represent themselves. And so when Dr. Curtin talks about safe, you know, those trauma-informed principles are so important, even in education, having safety or being able to have trust that the student might not say it in class, but they'll come and say it to Dr. Curtin. I really felt uncomfortable about that. And then it gives you something to work with the next time. But if they don't feel safe with you, then they carry that burden through the rest of the semester.
Yeah, true.
Dr. Smith, that's a really good point. And I can remember even in one of my face-to-face classes, I did an experiential interaction or had the students engage in an experience. And one of the students, it was a female student, had a pretty significant reaction. I wasn't quite sure what was going on. So I pulled her, you know, aside and talked to her. Well, you know, later what really came out is that she had been paired up with a white male. in the group. She was a white female, but she had had this experience as a woman in domestic violence. And so the experience was really triggering. So, you know, again, that's not necessarily the norm of what we might see in those classroom settings, but from a social justice perspective, again, making sure that we're not just narrow focused on race, we're not narrow focused on creed, but we're really looking at, you know, these initiatives and dynamics that impact, you know, those underrepresented populations or populations that might be vulnerable in our communities, and that we're talking about those dynamics. But it really simulated and gave us this opportunity to have this broader context of conversation, that though this was about domestic violence, but when we looked at gender issues, we could, you know, map that over to racial issues, poverty issues, and what that's like to feel like you're in this vulnerable situation that you felt powerless for, and you may not necessarily feel comfortable challenging that or feel that you are empowered or have the resources to challenge or combat that. Yeah. So it was very telling, and it was, you know, it helped us understand that situation contextually, but it also opened this door to this much more rich conversation about how those factors play out in other dynamics and why it's so important to embed it. You know, all of us would agree that we have accrediting bodies, we have best practice principles that would speak to diversity and cultural competence kinds of, standards that we should be embedding in our curriculum and our instructional guidelines. Not everyone will be very specific around those strategies and how we should engage, or ways in which, or to what degree, and how does it cut across. What's your thought about that accrediting bodies taking a stronger lens and reach on ensuring that diversity, but more importantly, social justice is embedded? Because I've gone through some accrediting pieces, and though they touch on it, and I think we're circling back to it, I think people, again, are somewhat hesitant and reluctant to be really defined about that. And what's your thoughts about that, particularly after what we have seen this past year in the tridemic?
Yeah. You know, Susan used the word, and I used to primarily relate it to when I did the research on disabilities, that there has to be some universality in the way that we engage people, the way we treat people, and we look at ourselves and others, and it should be that way. We should look at each human being in the same way that we would want to be looked at. Unfortunately, when people say, I don't see color, I know that then they don't see me. Yeah. And so how do you help people? It's all right to see color, because there's a lot of things about that. It's okay to see red here, blue here, whatever. But see that person in relationship to where they have come. And I always feel that you have to be honest with yourself that we all fall short. And so even though as I'm a Black woman, I could still have thoughts that are not kind and pleasant about other groups. And to recognize that and to catch myself, because those kind of thoughts don't make me any better than someone else who have those thoughts about me. And so I think that if we look at a universal approach, that all of us has to guard what we say and what we think and how we treat one another, it's less likely to occur more frequently. The problem is that we have some older adults who we're not going to change. We just going to have to accept how they are and be gracious about that, because some young people that I have encountered, they are in terrible pain at home because of the things that are said about their friends and whatever, and they can't speak up because they're young. And I don't know how you give kids the courage to speak up when someone says something mean or cruel about someone whom they care about or someone whom their friend. I think that's the part that gets me, is that kids are hearing things that are not going to reinforce social justice, and they don't have a voice.
Well, I know that, Dr. Bruce could probably speak to this, but I do know there's several curriculums that many districts and schools across the country have, embraced and have adopted that really talks about that bystander. You'll see the commercials about young people switching tables and going. And I think, we have to continue to combat these negative images and negative experiences that we know that they're reality, and be transparent about it. They exist. So what are the tools that we're given, not just our young people, but even, older folks who are, working in the field. And when you talked about, for example, earlier, the traumatic dynamics, how do we shift that? How do we break that cycle so that we're providing more quality, well-informed, impactful, meaningful pieces, and recognizing at the same time we're not always going to think the same, believe the same, but how we treat and engage one another is a different context. And so we are teaching. I love that poem, Carefully Taught, because the reality is we are all carefully taught about who we are in this world, how we see the world, and how we believe the world sees us. Dr. Bruce, anything in terms of the districts and schools K through 12 and the bullying and the models that they've adopted to really combat this?
Well, I can tell you one thing in the social work department, because I do feel I have several students who are in schools, Dr. Dixon, and one of the things I found is that many schools are now switching to what they call trauma-informed. So they work with young people in a way that helps them to deal with those kinds of things. And because they do, there is a tremendous amount of difference in those schools. And one particular tool they use is morning meetings. It kind of gauges where kids are. And so those kids who've had a rough time, they're able to help them modulate the behavior. So I think that it's the same way across all school districts, is that they have to recognize that being impoverished is traumatic, that when children are homeless, it's traumatic. It's just not that they don't have a physical home, but those psychosocial things that go with it. And so for kids, if we can provide them with a better outlook and coping skills, I think that their trajectory as adults become better. And so for me, the social justice part is we need to have people in districts where there is a significant amount of difference in the quality of life to help those young people think about their own lives differently, that it does matter, that I can go to college, that I can do some things that maybe not be a part of their regular life. And that's one of the things I think that social justice does, is that we provide resources that allow those who may not have a good start in life to have a better trajectory because we're there.
It's a great point, and I want to challenge both you and Dr. Curtin and even Dr. Bruce. Edinboro is interestingly located in a peculiar corner of Pennsylvania, Northwest Pennsylvania, and our history of working with FDI at the institution has been quite interesting, because you often will get people of different racial, ethnic, gender identity backgrounds who come to that institution, but it's really in a part of the country or the state that is very unique and small. It's not a rural community, but it is definitely a set aside, almost rural, it's on the borders of being considered rural. What do you think some of the challenges were, or some of the things that you can recall about, working around social justice issues, and what did you see as some of our challenges, not necessarily to the institution of EU, but being in the environment or the culture with limited like urban or metropolitan supports around it?
Yeah. Dr. Bruce, do you want to comment?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to unmute for the last question, and I was like, "What is going on?"
I can tell you wanted to.
Just to add 2 cents to that before I answer this one, as Dr. Smith was saying, it's in those school systems, yes, they are implementing the trauma-informed practices, and I think it's good that that happens because, and also what you said last time about I don't see color, I think that was one of the things that was hindering those educators who had best intentions. They thought that by saying I don't see color, they were actually including their students of color, but they were actually excluding them and trying to erase their racial identity, and that was the problem. So I think, you know, seeing color, you need to, so that you can help that student overcome whatever those challenges are that comes with that impoverished community, as Dr. Smith was saying. So the trauma-informed practice, you know, we do have certain resources that we can pull on or pull from, and when we come together as a community, as educators, then we can best help serve those students, because their everyday isn't ideal. Even now with distance learning, I still have a few colleagues that are we have candid conversations every now and again, but for those students of color, they don't turn their cameras on now because they feel like their background isn't suitable for their peers to see. And they have their white students who live in townhouses and apartments that have views and different things that just their background may be chaotic, and they don't want people to see that. So I know one of my friends, she said that she had asked a student of color to turn the camera on, and they private messaged her saying, I don't want to because my mom is in the background smoking a cigarette, and I just feel like that's inappropriate. And then, you know, and this person, she's white, and she was like, okay, this is one of the things where I know that my upbringing is a little bit different from this child. And then moving forward, she said, is it wrong for me to allow students of color to keep their cameras off during my classes? And I was like, I don't think it's wrong. I mean, I feel like you're meeting them where they are. Some of them feel uncomfortable. Some of them are honestly just abusing the system. And they're just probably in their bed and don't want to turn the camera on. But you do have some students that are being affected, and they do feel embarrassed by their living situation, and they don't want their peers to see that because they came to the school building to get rid of that side, to hide where they come from, to have an equal, fair chance at life. So I do believe that you need to see color, you need to see students where they are to best help them move forward. So that's what I wanted to say about that last question. This question pertaining to Edinboro, yes, the first day I was there, I was looking for a barbershop to get a haircut, and I was like, oh no, this is not gonna work for me. There was nobody in Edinboro, Pennsylvania who was able to do a low fade on a Black man. So I end up having to get a haircut in Erie because they have some urban barbershops that can cut Black hair. And there is a difference. You just can't walk into any barbershop and ask, hey, can you give me a low fade? You have to go to a barber that knows how to cut your hair type, because we have different hair textures. And once again, that goes back to, if I would have went in the shop and everyone's like, oh man, come get a haircut, I don't see color, that's problematic, because there's a difference between your hair texture and mine. So you need to see that. You need to be well trained in working with my hair pattern in order to cut it appropriately.
Yeah, Dr. Dixon, I think I would say that that's the hard part, is this cannot just happen in the classroom. This really has to be at the entire university level, at the entire community level. It just cannot be done in isolation. You know, and we as educators cannot expect our students to teach us. Mm-hmm. We need to be informed, and we need to know about this and be aware and create the culture in which all students will feel comfortable. But you're right, it extends well beyond the classroom.
A great point. I mean, you know, Dr. Bruce, I had the same experience when I first came, you know, to the Erie community about, you know, and it's beyond, we're using an example of hair care, but even think about access to medical care. We had hopes that we could get a team together to talk about healthcare and access that from a social justice perspective. What are some of the differences? Even something as simple as, you know, ringworm, you know, I've had worked with young people and they had ringworm, they were African American or Latino, and you know, oh no, that's just eczema. No, that is not eczema, that's ringworm. So if you don't understand, even well-trained medical professionals understand contextually what is going on. Dr. Gloria Johnson-Powell, who is an African-American psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins University. She talked about, you know, she did a book and she talked about pharmacology and working with, you know, again, not just African-Americans, Latinos, Mediterraneans, but people when there's diversity like that. Even certain medications, those trials tend not to necessarily have a significant number of people who represent those categories. So you don't necessarily have really strong data about what implications are around pigmentation, around certain genetic kinds of makeup. Like there are certain groups of people who might carry the sickle cell trait. Is there implications with certain medications and et cetera? So there are all kinds of dynamics that we often don't really talk about. Healthcare or nutrition, you know, being at an institution or university with some of the healthcare things, there's dietary kinds of things that are peculiar foods and access to that are different amongst different groups, from Asians to Latinos to African Americans. And of course we have this common ground, but there's, again, it is a much more rich, fluid conversation, appreciation for the impact of not just color and diversity, but for particular groups of people when you're coming out of those communities that might have had historic traumatization around social justice and cultural diversity dynamics, going into another setting where things may happen that may not have anything necessarily intentionally around those past experiences, but may now become a confabulation and reinforcement for them, or redefining to them that there's not justice for me, and we don't experience this equally based on some differential, whether it's a power differential of color, a power differential of gender, a power differential around size, creed, whatever that may be. And I think you spoke well to this, Dr. Curtin, is that we must be aware of those things and we have to educate and look at advocating for ways that we can shift it, because oftentimes the belief is that it's intentional or there's a lack of willingness to do it. And many times it's just a lack of understanding and a lack of awareness. And so I really appreciate that once prior that you know, when you were at EU, you started this group with students. You had this nice cross section of young people who came together and had these conversations, teaching them about that you were not only mentoring them, but teaching them about advocacy and teaching them about leadership, so that there was that opportunity to embed across the university and across systems and across auxiliaries and programs, an appreciation and an understanding around the awareness and dynamics. And again, we need to continue to do that work, certainly beyond the borders of our institution, but as we're training emerging professionals, educators, pre-med students, political science folks who are going to impact policy, et cetera, this is this opportunity to make sure we're embedding these constructs, just having these dialogues within our classroom, and making sure that we're creating, as you would say, the culture, the context, and the safe zone that they can move forward in this dialogue and these conversations.
I think Frederick Douglass is definitely supports that. And it speaks well to the university that it continues. Because where you put your resources it shows what you value.
Well said, Dr. Curtin. You know, I don't see any other comments in the chat. I'll just give our panelists a final opportunity. Our hour is already up. Can you imagine that? I'll give our panelists a final opportunity to give some final comments as we get ready to end today's discussion. We'll go ahead and start with you, Dr. Bruce. Any final comments? Then we'll move to Dr. Smith and then to Dr. Curtin.
I just want to thank everyone for taking out the time to be here and just being in this space. Definitely want to thank Dr. Curtin and Dr. Smith for joining us. I know your schedules are probably pretty busy, but you found it in your schedule to fit us in, and you know the work that we're doing here is meaningful because you guys were doing the work prior to us two taking over. And for all the people who were listening in on Facebook, the people who were here on the Zoom, you can reach out to me via email if you have any other additional questions. If, you know, I know some people don't like to ask questions in group settings and you may want to have a more intimate conversation about this, or if you want to know how to help, how to move forward, if you want resources, anything, I'm available to you. So I can be reached. I'm gonna put my email in the chat. It is kbruce@edinboro.edu. And
Got you, Dr. Bruce.
yeah, and yeah, thank you guys for listening. Thank you for joining. Thank you for being here. That's all.
What most I feel is that in order for the work to go forward, there are really sound areas that we don't have to think about. The data is there. So if you think about, if you look, African-American women who are pregnant have 5 times risk of having a miscarriage than a white person who is pregnant and goes into maternity. So we have data to just look at the pandemic. Who seems to have the greatest burden? So I think that we don't have to look far. We just have to look in our little corner. And I think that if each one of us look at the parameters and where we are, we can do a good work where we are. We don't have to look too far. We can look right where we are, and I think we can do a good work. And when I think about Erie, I think about the time I came here and someone said to me, what side do you live on? And I couldn't understand why. And right across the street from me is the east side and I'm on the west side. And I couldn't understand, but systemically, people on the west side get better service than people on the east side. And I know that. And so that's one of the things that I talk about when we have meetings here, is that we should have parallel services. Because I live on one side doesn't mean that I should get a better service. I left my trash out one day and it didn't get picked up. I called, and in 10 minutes, there was someone here to pick up my trash. My son lives on the east side. His trash was left out. He was told to put it back in the yard. So right in our own area, there's work to be done. We don't have to look far. So that's what I say, work in your own backyard. Don't go to somebody else's.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that, social justice happens one conversation at a time. Right? And don't wait for that conversation. You don't have to wait for someone to initiate it. You can initiate that conversation and create that safe space so that we can all be lifted up. Our country's had a big crisis, and with every crisis, there is an opportunity. And so we have an opportunity to grow together, and I would encourage you to have the courage to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you all again for joining us. Again, we've navigated not just the Corona-19 virus from last year. It's almost a full year that we've experienced that, but we certainly have gone through a tridemic of social injustice and even the financial insecurities that we've seen. And so it is so clear that social justice initiatives are really critical. We've seen time and time again, certainly with the extreme end of this, with the deaths of folks like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and others who have lost their lives. But when we see the use of gender and race to threaten people, to intimidate them, when we see that this plays out in communities that have resources, the haves and the have-nots, it is so imperative that we continue to push these efforts forward, that we support social justice opportunities, and that we're teaching our young people at a very young age about how to do that and how to advocate and to be aware of these dynamics, and certainly to make sure that we are supporting opportunities to how do I want to say this, impact the systemic nature where we see discriminatory practices or embedded practices that reinforce discriminatory kind of practices, beliefs, guidelines, etc., and that we replace them with more pro-social and healthy social justice initiatives. So again, we thank you all for joining us in this conversation and bringing some awareness to this really meaningful and impactful conversation. I just want to end with what Gandhi would say, is that we all are required to be the change that we want to see. And so we cannot sit quietly and watch and think that someone else is going to step to the plate. It is our reasonable service to step up and to have impact on this. And so to our panelists, thank you so much for your reasonable service, for your service above and beyond the call of duty, and to all of you who have joined us in today's conversation. Those of you who are even joining us on Facebook, thank you for being a part of this social justice movement. We appreciate all of your efforts and all that you do. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.